Oh, we got our first question.
Yeah.
I got a question. Okay. I'm Judy Stein, and I'm the voice of Camden Conference here for the evening, and welcome to all of you. We're doing this one a little bit differently in that we will not see everyone tonight, but hopefully you will, four of us, and we hope everybody else is mute so that the dogs, the cats, and the other things that go by the streets don't come on tonight. I am going to introduce David Clark, who is the producer of the film. And David will start and he will introduce Ed and Bryce, and I won't even tell, well, if you've just seen them, you know who they are. They've been there. If you would be kind enough to put your questions into chat, and I will try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. And you can direct them to a specific speaker, or you can make them general in context. So that's where we are. It'd be fun if you'll give us the town you're from when you do the question. If you don't, you don't. So with that, David, your people are never in the same places. So David Clark, you're on, you speak.
All right, well, thank you, Judy. And I want to thank the Camden Conference for making this film available to the conference participants. And I want to thank Brendan from the Belfast Library for helping make this Zoom happen tonight. And welcome, everybody. I was the producer and co-director of the film. I was also one of the co-principal investigators, so I was involved in creating the itinerary, determining where we went, and also was responsible for bringing some of the professionals on board that were non-scientists. So I'll go ahead and let Bryce and Ed introduce themselves. Bryce?
Thanks, Dave. Evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me and that I'm not being buffered too badly. So I'm Bryce Luce. I was the expedition chief scientist and also a co-PI. I've known Dave for a few years now as we've worked through the different iterations on this project, and it was a real pleasure to get to participate in the concept that he and the other person at URI who developed it, Gail Scowcroft, came up with, and then it was really exciting to sail with him and also here with Ed Struzik and hear so much about his perspective on the Arctic over a long period of time and with such a broad array of knowledge. So I'll pass it on to you, Ed.
Ed Struzik. I'm a writer currently for Island Press in Washington, D.C., a company that's been publishing my books lately. And I'm also a fellow at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University in Canada.
Startup, unchecked hyperbole has driven its mental market share way out of proportion. Beneath the mountains of wishful thinking and predictions, there is merit. Make no mistake.
So we all need to be careful about hyperbole this evening. Let's keep that at front of mind as we have our discussion.
I don't know where that came from. I'm gonna mute. I'm looking. Sorry, guys.
Okay.
All right.
I spent, I've gone up to the Arctic every year for the past 40 years. I lived in the Northwest Territories of Canada and the Yukon Territory of Canada. I worked for the National Park Service in the Yukon, and I was a journalist for a news service. I was the one and only person in the Arctic Bureau, which existed. So I got to travel throughout the circumpolar world throughout the late 70s and 80s and 90s in pursuit of good stories.
And because I said I was going to do this, everyone, this is Ed's book, Future Arctic, which I'm most of the way through, and I highly recommend everyone on this subject, and I don't get paid for that. But I'm going to start because I've got a couple on here that relate to plastics. gentlemen, and what the sense, how the students reacted to that mass of plastics is question one, and question two is, what's your perception of what can be done, what if anything can be done about that? So I don't know. You want to start, Bryce? Maybe that's you.
Sure. No, those are great questions. Thank you. So I think that just like the scientists and just like the film kind of portrays, I think the students in general were very shocked by this finding, and just to fill in some of the details, that an expedition in this ice. So this is basically the ice floating on top of the ocean, and that appears to be like a concentrator of plastic. So the density of plastic in the ice is much higher than what you would see in the water. But I think the other part of it, and this was what was exciting about working with this group of students, is that the discovery was very, I'd say, galvanizing. Like it really brought to a sharp focus the importance of basically the study of the very processes that we were up there to look at. So the awareness that the activities that humans carry out throughout the all over the planet make it all the way up to the Arctic, either lofted in by air masses or are washed in off the land, or potentially as a result of ocean currents, which circulate from both the Pacific and the Atlantic into the interior Arctic. And so that, coupled with the fact that it was an extremely warm summer, like during the time when we were aboard the Odin in the Northwest Passage, there were wildfires on Greenland, right, which is known to be covered by miles of ice, but southern Greenland was having wildfires at the time. So it was in every direction we looked, the signs of human activity were everywhere. And was there a second part to that that I didn't cover? Oh, what can be done about it? I think that that's a more challenging one, but it is certainly true that what we're discovering is plastic is kind of ever present in the environment, and maybe it's not surprising when you think about it because of the way we use plastic. And I think one interesting detail is that a lot of the material that we found was actually the microfibers. So these nylon and polyester and other fibers that are used for weaves, rope, a lot of clothing, that sort of thing. And we saw a really high concentration of those in the sea ice. And so that would suggest that these fibers are being like liberated and degraded just by everyday use of, for example, with clothing and things like that. And so it may be possible to actually divert some of that waste stream before it gets into the surface water, which of course washes into the ocean and beyond that. And so people are trying to I think curb that pollution at the source with plastic trapping devices inside the washing machine and stuff. And so these are, if you're looking for a way to like personally cut down on your plastic emissions footprint, that might be one approach. Obviously buying in bulk, but anyway, I won't go into all of those solutions. But indeed, just to come back to the part about what the impact was on the students, I'd say shocking, but also galvanizing.
Well, interestingly, there's another question that asks that the crew, and I think the students as well, appeared to be wearing synthetic, the jackets. And did anyone kind of balk at that, or was that what there was?
Well,
no, yes, we all do, right?
Actually, because the students had never been to the Arctic before, they didn't have Arctic gear. And those suits are highly visible, which is important when you're out on the ice. They're also, not besides being very warm, they are float coats, so they're a survival type suit. And they are part of the working inventory of the ship. So that's why they were used.
Interestingly, that's an issue as well on the Antarctic trips, where everyone is issued a jacket that looked very much like that.
Yeah.
So Ed, I've got one for you that as you're looking forward, with the retreating ice and the animals and the plant migration and the number of the things that you wrote about, I have a question from someone here. What are the top 3 geopolitical implications that you see going forward?
Geopolitical.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you see China for one is trying to, establish itself in the Arctic. They just recently tried to buy up a gold mine in the Canadian Arctic. The Canadian government turned them down. They've been trying to get into Greenland, and with some success. They've even tried to get into Iceland. And it's unclear as to really what the intentions of China is. They are now, along with Korea, building icebreakers at a rapid rate, far more faster than the United States. If you compare the number of icebreakers that the United States has to compare to, say, Russia, the United States has 2 or 3 putt-putts, really old icebreakers. They're building one new one. Russia has over 50. China is moving in that direction very rapidly. Korea is as well. And largely it's because they foresee that the Arctic is going to be resource rich, and it's also going to be a shortcut to get their trade goods from one part of the world to the other. And so if you establish maritime dominance, you have a certain amount of power. And if you don't have icebreakers to be able to monitor what's going on, you're just hoping for the best, maybe spy on them by satellites. So I think there are some very important geopolitical considerations at play here.
All right. Where am I going?
Somebody asked who owns the Odin. The Odin
Yes.
is owned by the country of Sweden, but it's operated by the Swedish Polar Research Secretariat. And its mission is polar research, and been to Antarctica several times as well. They have worked with the National Science Foundation in the past. They do have a role in keeping some of the channels open in Sweden during the winter months, but they are primarily dedicated to polar research, and they just were a superb platform and crew to work with. So often working research vessels, it's kind of a job for the people, but all of the crew in the Odin, they care so much about the polar environment. They were just so enthusiastic and so interested in what we were doing and so willing to help. It was a delight. It was a pleasure to work with them. And the ship was so capable. It had 2 helicopters. It could ferry us to remote areas much quicker than deploying small boats and so forth. So it really was a great platform.
Okay. So we talked about the plastic, and there's another question that asks whether you tested for other particulate matter besides plastic, and whether water clarity, affected by flows of rivers, carrying things.
Yeah, so I can say that we were also collecting samples and filtering them. So collecting water samples and ice samples, and essentially concentrating the particulate matter that's in the water to look at the total organic carbon content. So this can be a measure of both ecosystem, like it can be a measure of the ecosystem productivity at the smallest level with the plankton and the other organisms that photosynthesize. It can also be in the Arctic an important indicator of land-based organic carbon that's being washed off either as a result of like summer melt of permafrost or in the rivers, or in the case of what Ed was describing to us earlier, just before the panel started, the liberation of peat, right? Ed, do you want to speak to that at all?
Sure. Much of the Arctic is covered in permafrost that stays frozen year round. The actual definition is it stays frozen for 2 years in a row, and most of it is frozen. And in that frozen permafrost, we have a lot of peat, but we also have a lot of mercury. Some of it natural, some of it that comes in that's transported from coal-fired plants around the world. And the beauty of the permafrost is that it traps it into the peat and it stores it. It's an anaerobic environment, and so it's basically harmless. But once that permafrost starts to thaw, the microbes start that the mercury is attached to start to work away, and it turns that harmless mercury into methyl mercury, which is extremely toxic. And we're now seeing very high levels of mercury in polar bears, beluga whales, a lot of Arctic seabirds. And it's just getting flushed into those rivers that flow into the Arctic. And if you look at the Arctic Ocean, is not it's not a stationary thing. There are very powerful currents, such as the Beaufort Gyre. You can see here that it basically takes up all of the fresh water coming in from the Yukon River in Alaska and the Mackenzie River in Canada, which is bringing that mercury and all of the peat and all of the sediments, and it's swirling it around and swirling it around, and it traps it there for quite some time. And it also traps a lot of fresh water coming in from the Pacific Ocean. That's fresh water. The gyre at one point is going to slow down and reverse, and it's going to send all that water through the archipelago into the Atlantic Ocean, and then it's going to spread around by other currents around the world. So it's not just the Arctic that's in peril; it's the rest of the world that has a problem with this.
So a little bit different question from Linda. Do you get much information about the Arctic from satellites? Anybody got a thought?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. As you probably know, NASA has an Earth observing system. So they've got basically satellites that are focused at the Earth for this specific purpose to observe all parts of the Earth's surface. But they even have some that are very specifically focused on the two poles. In fact, there was a satellite launched in 2018 called ISAT-2, which you can find on the NASA website, and it's a state-of-the-art cryosphere satellite. So it's able to go over the surface of the surface of the land and basically measure the thickness of the ice that's on both like the landed ice, but also the ice that's floating on the ocean. And so by doing that repeatedly, they can look at actually the thinning of glaciers, and they're doing it with lasers using what's called LiDAR, which stands for like laser imaging, detecting, and ranging. So basically the point is you with high precision, like to the order of centimeters now from space, they can detect these thickness changes in ice over the Arctic. Some of their satellites can actually see into the surface ocean now with the similar technology, so we can observe for the first time organisms like the migration of plankton and other organisms as they move around vertically in the water column. So it's a really useful tool, and a lot of the data is publicly available. The European Space Agency similarly has satellites that are very focused on the Arctic. So I think there's just a continual awareness that this is a really important tool.
And we also have satellites that are tracking the movements of polar bears, narwhal, and beluga whales to see where they go. How are they being impacted by a warming Arctic and sea ice retreating? And so you've got this, a lot of scientists out there. I've had the privilege of being involved in these captures, and it's just amazing to see how far a polar bear can travel in a single season. The one that fascinated me most was one that was in Russia, traveled all the way with her cub to Alaska, and then over into Canada, and then up to the North Pole, and then started heading back to Russia all in 1 year. That's not typical, but it's probably a sign that they're just looking for new territory, that maybe where that territory that they once had just isn't supplying them with enough food. And so I think this is sort of a bit of a desperation move for a lot of these species, trying to figure out, where do you go?
Huh. I have one from Bruce, from Hope. Does the ship traffic hasten the ice melt? Is that going to be an issue? Is there, less, more traffic, less ice? Is question.
So I think that's a really interesting question, Bruce, and I'm not sure I have a definitive answer, but I would say that this is a topic that we have considered, and I think that people will begin to look into. So two things happen, just as you said. When you break up the ice, you essentially create like a fracture through the surface of the ice, which you could imagine disrupts some of the basically the tensile strength of the ice, the ability of the ice to transmit itself across the ocean surface. And so as you break that up, of course, you also introduce more surface water into the area where the ice pack was broken up. And this is potentially probably not an important term in terms of absorbing heat, but maybe in terms of the rheology of the ice, the ability of it to maintain like a single cohesive ice pack. Another big factor, which may not be just solely a result of ships, but also has to do with like transmission of air masses, is black carbon and other aerosols, which come certainly from ship exhaust, but also come from coal fire power plants and other biomass burning on land. When that stuff lands on the glaciers and when it lands on ice, of course it's black, right? So it looks a little bit like soot, and you can see real clear evidence of an exaggeration in melting when that soot lands on, for example, a relatively white surface. So it certainly accelerates the melting process. And so that's another possibility I think that we have to be really aware of, and this has got to be something that we monitor and look for as Arctic opens up.
It's an emerging issue in Arctic Canada because if you think about it, the Inuit, there are no roads in Nunavut, and there's only one in the Northwest Territories. And so they travel by snow in wintertime, and they travel on the ice. And increasingly what's happening is when the ships pass through, they go to some of these mining sites on Baffin Island, they create these open lanes of water that don't allow the Inuit to get to their hunting grounds. And so what's happening now is they're setting up agreements with mining companies and with shipping companies to track and to come only at certain times to avoid areas so that these highways for the Inuit are not broken up. And if you can imagine, there's not much traffic up there, but say if the Chinese and the Russians start using the Arctic as a shortcut to other parts of the world, we see a whole bunch of traffic there, then I think that could really create a lot of problems for sea ice breakup, for Inuit traveling, etc.
When you said they make agreements with the mining companies, are these agreements with the Canadian government, or are they agreements with the Inuit?
It's the agreements with the Inuit hunters. They have these associations. They're called the Hunters and Trappers Associations. So what a shipping company now does typically in some parts of the Arctic is that they will inform the Hunters and Trappers Association ahead of time, here's where we're going to go, so that if you're going to go hunting in this part of the Arctic, beware, because that ice could be thin. You may not notice the lane, but it could be just a very thin sheet of ice and you could go through. And also they have an agreement, I don't know how well it's just beginning, is that the Inuit hunters can say, well, this is a really busy time of year for us, hunting whales or fishing. Please stay out of this particular area, avoid it, go around it. And I think it's a positive development. Just how far it will go, I don't These are the sort of things that are getting worked out that now that you would never even think that would happen 5-10 years ago.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about students. One being how they're selected in the first place, and the other, we're dealing with them at both ends, and the other one being, are you following up with them? Do you have a sense that of how this is going to influence them going forward with the influence that it's having on them? So how do you pick them, and what do we know about them after the fact?
Well, I can start with that. Bryce can probably address it as well. It was actually a very rigorous selection process because of the grant from the National Science Foundation's Division of Research and Learning. They wanted to test whether undergraduate and graduate students exposed to real research would inspire STEM-related, careers in science and so forth. So there's actually a lot of follow through. We wanted regional diversity. So 5 universities from California to New York to Florida to Chicago were selected. The selection process took place in minority serving colleges, which means that at least 50% of the population were minorities. And it was very rigorous. They had to demonstrate a real strength in science and desire to be on the trip and so forth. As far as the follow-up, there will be a lot of it. Part of the plan was to show this film at each of the participating colleges, which we've just finished doing this last month. And the students and their peers engaged in panel discussions like this one. There's going to be there was going to be an in-person, but now it's a 2-day Zoom conference with all of the student participants and the University of Rhode Island. Their progress and the consequences of this trip is going to be followed for some time. So it was rigorous. And I see somebody else asked whether or not this could be a model for other projects. I think there's a strong demand to engage young people in projects like this that might steer them into a career in science. The challenge is these type projects are very expensive to mount. I mean, it took us years to sort of pull this one all together, but I'm ready to go on the next one. That if we can get the funding and whatnot. I was saying that it would be great to do a bookend in Antarctica, because the Odin goes to Antarctica as well. But getting 20, 30 students down to Antarctica would be a real challenge. But in any case, I hope this is not the last experience like this.
So one to follow up on that, there's a question here that would you consider doing a film that focused on not on a narrower range of research topics?
Well, sure. I mean, there's lots of research going on out there that is worthy of being documented. It's got to have a certain attractiveness to an audience. There's got to be a purpose for it, a goal, and then you've got to raise the money to do it. So, yeah, I mean, this certainly is not the first film to document the process of field research, and there's endless research topics out there, and I know I'm not the only one that would love doing more films like this that document real feet on the ground research and what it's doing and how it inspires young people.
All right, I'm going to come back. We got part of an answer. It may be that it's too soon, but the question really was: do you know much yet about the effect that this has actually had on these on the students, whether they are moving forward in this, or is it too soon?
Bryce may have some insight. I mean, I do know that several of the undergraduate students have now gone on to graduate school in the sciences. And a few of the students want to become teachers. Whether the project inspired that, I think it's too early to to sort of divine what the the consequences were of these student experiences. But I can tell you from these screenings and panel discussions we've had with the student participants, this was a life-changing experience. And you can see how it would be to be able to go to a place like the Arctic on an 18-day expedition like this. But Bryce was working very closely with the students. Maybe he has some perspective on how it affected them and what impressions it made.
Yeah, Dave, thanks. I think I would just reiterate what you had already said, which is that we were still in active contact with them, and we're planning this summer workshop, which will be focused largely around science, but also a little bit around kind of like their narratives and what their plans are for the future. And the anecdotal information is that a lot of them, or a significant number, have gone on or are going on to graduate school in the sciences, not necessarily in earth or ocean sciences, but they have chosen a field that is basically within the STEM career path. And they at least convey to us that a large part of their motivation was derived from participating in this project, in large part because they felt like once they did this, they could really visualize themselves as scientists. Because the real truth is, when they're aboard the vessel and when we're doing the activities that we're doing, they really are collecting, the quality of data and the kind of data that we will absolutely use for peer-reviewed publications at the highest level. So in many respects, they're doing what we do, which is to sort of push back the boundary of knowledge. And I think that feeling for them was really empowering. And so it's really exciting to watch them kind of build on that perspective, build on that self-visualization, and carry it into the future. Whether or not we'll be able to, I think it's, as Dave said, too early to know if we've put our finger on the scale enough to nudge a statistically significant increase in students going off to science trajectories. I don't know, but I think that this project, because of the way it was conceived, because it had so much support from NSF's education division, it probably has the best potential to actually chart that and track that, because that's been a part of the project from the beginning, this kind of like social science data gathering that's gone along with the project. So stay tuned. Let's see what comes of them.
So,
well, also in addition, an innovation of this expedition was the live interactive satellite broadcasts from the Arctic to 3 museums in the United States. And, the young audiences there are also experiencing what it's like to be doing research in the Arctic. So these young college kids were reaching out to museum audience children. And that was another innovative way of reaching even a broader spectrum of young people. And the Inner Space Center at the University of Rhode Island is a unique place that they call it telepresence, and they can broadcast from any ship anywhere in the world to a museum or a school. And the people that are at the receiving end are experiencing, what the people on the ship are experiencing. So that's an empowering way of communicating also.
Question, I guess that how did you have support? How does a project like this get started?
I think they start different ways. I mean, pure oceanographic research draws on the funding of the universities and the collaborators and the funding organizations. This project began a little strange. It began as my vision for a documentary, and I reached out to the University of Rhode Island and wanted to be able to do satellite broadcasts, to people back in the States. And Gail Scowcroft at the University of Rhode Island said, well, look, let's make it a bona fide research expedition and let's add students with it. And that enabled us to get the funding from the National Science Foundation. So, the kernel of an idea was to just do a documentary about climate change and the loss of ice in the Arctic. But then it grew into a full-blown expedition that involved students and learning, and ended up being funded by all different divisions of NSF, their polar research programs, their division of research and learning, and so forth. So the genesis was kind of unique with this project, but it was innovative enough that everybody got behind it, and I think that's why it was successful.
Okay, I've got one for all of you from David in Camden. At this point in the history of the planet, what do you see the Arctic and its people? What did they offer? What can we all learn from them, those of us not living there? So that's to all three of you.
Ed, why don't you start with it? You know the Indigenous people, and I'm sure you've got something to say on that.
Well, I think it's a lonely part of the world. You look at the between Alaska, the Yukon, and Northwest Territories, you've got less than 500,000 people inhabiting that part of the world. In fact, only 3 million people inhabiting the entire circumpolar world, and most of them in very, very small communities. If you take out places like Anchorage and Fairbanks, and Yellowknife and Inuvik, then most of the towns are 800 people. They have a lot to tell us. I think that they've passed on their histories from one generation to another. They understand the local ecology better than any person looking at a satellite. So I think that there's some synergy that can be can give us an advantage in how the old Arctic that we know is disappearing. The Inuit know that. The polar people know that. What was there 20 years ago is disappearing quickly, and a new Arctic is unfolding. I think the trick now is how do we map out a new Arctic? How do we help them find a place in this Arctic? They're very adaptive. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been around as long as they have. So I think there's got to be a lot more give and take. We used to be messengers of authority, that we would tell them what to do. We would put them into our schools, and we would tell them, how, when they could hunt, what they could hunt. I think that it's got to be more of a partnership now than it was in the past. It's kind of like an all hands on deck situation, because it really is a catastrophic unfolding that we're seeing. Not necessarily a terrible end, but certainly something very different is coming to the fore.
Bryce?
Okay, well, I'm just going to talk about, I think, what I've learned personally from learning how the Inuit share information, and that's that you can't underestimate the power of a good story to both stick in your brain as something that you just, it's so captivating that you don't forget it, and additionally that if the story is told right, it has all the nuggets of data and information that you would need in order to reconstruct the subject of the story. And so this is, there's some great anecdotes, for example, about what the Inuit knew about somebody. I'm just scanning back through the chat here. It was Gail was asking about who's doing further research on the vessels that, like the Franklin expedition, which were lost in the Arctic during the age of exploration. And so there's these great stories that the Inuit, and I'm probably going to mess this up, Ed can straighten it out for me, that they were always aware of exactly where the vessels were as well as where the people were, but nobody was asking them, at least nobody from the West was asking them, but they were relaying this information amongst themselves. And all of that information is passed on in the form of basically a story. So my takeaway from that is don't underestimate the power of a story to capture the imagination. And I try to bring that into science a little bit. And the other part is for my children and eventually grandchildren and anybody else who I interact with, I think I'm going to always try to frame my lessons as stories because they just seem to, like I said, stick in the brain better than dry facts.
I just add to that, there's a great story that I was told in the 1970s when I lived in the Yukon, that the people in the Western Arctic believed that truly believed there was these giant beavers that used to terrorize hunters in the Arctic at one point. And it became kind of a myth, a quaint folklore until someone, a scientist, paleontologist I know, Dick Harrington, actually unearthed a 8-foot-long beaver in the Porcupine River in the Yukon, close to the Alaska border. And now we know that we've found all kinds of evidence of 8-foot-long beavers all over the place in the Arctic. So this is a story that they've had is passed on from one generation to the other, and we kind of dismissed it as being legend, when in fact that there really was some truth to it.
I'd like to add that the legacy of Indigenous people have been just run over so many times in so many parts of the world, and they've had so little say in their future and so forth. And luckily, the Canadian government has really stepped up and is now working closely with the Nunavut territories. And it's very important. And they really do, the Inuit really do have a sense that they are helping control their own destiny. For us to go up there, all of our activities had to be approved by the Nunavut Review Board. We needed a permit to film wildlife. We needed a permit to visit cultural sites. We had to have permission to go ashore. So as commercial interests and tourism expands in the Arctic, at least in the Eastern Arctic, the Nunavut government is really making a great effort to control things. And another very hopeful sign, just in the last couple of years, Ed might be able to pronounce the name of it, but a very, very large marine sanctuary in Lancaster Sound has been created, protecting the marine mammals there, and there's all kinds of restrictions. And this was done in part, by the Nunavut people working with the government of Canada.
If you look at every single Arctic park in Canada has been created on the back of land owned by the Inuit or the Indigenous people of the Western Arctic. It's land that they owned legally through land claims and agreement. And part of the land claim agreement was that they would create these giant parks like Olivik, Ivivik, Quaternipuk on Ellesmere Island. There's about, I think, 11 or 12 of them. They were all created thanks to the Inuit. It wasn't the Canadian government that created them. It was the Inuit had said, this is our land. We like your concept of a national park. So we're giving you the national park in exchange for, their continued right to be able to hunt on that land, but there will be no oil and gas activity, no mining in those areas. And I think this is one of the things that they've contributed to conservation that has largely gone unnoticed. In fact, most people in Canada don't even have a clue how these parks got their start, but it was because of the Inuit people.
What else are we missing, guys? Wow. I had, and I missed one earlier. But someone who had been involved, I guess, in Project O in the original Project Oceanography, who asked if any of the three of you had been involved when you were younger scholars in any projects of this kind.
Not me. I've always had an interest in ocean-related topics, but I never had an opportunity as a young person. No.
No, the closest I came was mid-career when I was invited by an oceanographer to come along on a 6-week expedition. But my role would be that I would have to participate as an oceanographer, meaning I had to get up every 6 hours to go and collect samples and freeze with everybody else. That's about as close as I've come to the real work of being an oceanographer. It's tough work.
How about your inspiration, Bryce? What inspired you to your career?
Bryce, yeah.
So I guess I do credit an experience I had as a boy for at least becoming an oceanographer. I'm from the desert, actually. I'm from New Mexico, so I don't consider my trajectory necessarily preordained, but I was a Boy Scout, and there used to be a Sea Scout base in Newport Beach, California. And somehow word of the fact that they had a tall ship trickled out to us in New Mexico. And we had just finished going to the Philmont Scout Camp, which is a very large preserve, and hiking like 100 miles in 12 days. And I had the worst blisters, and I did not want to do that again. So I tried to cleverly divert the group and suggest that next year's activity should be aboard this vessel. And to my surprise, the Scoutmasters took us up on it. So we took the train out there and we stayed for a week on this vessel, the Argus, and sailed around Catalina Island. And I think the thing that maybe sealed my fate was the fact that I was the only one amongst us who didn't get seasick. I would say that there's nothing else necessarily that predisposed me to oceanography, but I was able to handle the role from the beginning, and it's been a love of the ocean developing ever since. So not exactly science, but a great experience aboard this vessel, which unfortunately just after the turn of the millennium, I think it caught fire and sank in the harbor, so that's not available anymore. But so if anybody out there is involved in studying or other organizations, somebody actually mentioned SEA. That's probably the premier ocean going education program. So that's the Sea Education Association, which is based in Woods Hole. In fact, I'm just looking through the chat. This again was Gail. Sorry.
This semester at
What's that?
sea. On this.
That's right. Yes, so they hold the Semester at Sea program. That's right.
Yeah.
You can basically, I think them and another organization, you can spend up to a semester, I guess, afloat doing research, but also your regular schooling as you transit some large section of the ocean. And I think initially that might have been some of the inspiration for the nucleus of the idea that Dave and Gail came up with, was a little bit like a program that SEA does, but on maybe a shorter duration for the students.
So my last question, because we're out of time, but it's been asked in a number of different ways. Where are you going? Where are you going from here? What's the focus in the future of the Arctic, Bryce?
Okay, I'll start this, but I think each of us has to answer this individually, because I think you'll get a different answer from each of the three of us.
I'm just going to do that.
Okay, yes. And so I'll just quickly say that following the Northwest Passage project, I was involved in this program that was initiated by the German government and by the U.S. National Science Foundation, called the Mosaic Drift Project. And this is the first expedition of its time, at least in the last 20 years. And so the goal here was to collect a year's worth of data in the Arctic. And the only real feasible way to do this is with the kind of icebreakers that we have, is to just allow the icebreaker to freeze into the ice pack and basically just drift. So in October of 2019, just after the Northwest Passage, we joined we put our science gear on this German icebreaker, the Polarstern, and it froze into the just north of the Laptev Sea on the Russian side. And true to form, it drifted just as expected over the course of the next year. It basically exited the Arctic into the North Atlantic, and that was a tremendously revealing project. It was something like 600 scientists participating from all over the planet, from 19 different countries, and we collected information on all aspects, at least of the physical and chemical Arctic, not necessarily societal aspects, but we studied the atmosphere. We studied the sea ice as both a physical system, but also as an ecosystem. We studied the ocean column, and then we studied the ecosystems that subsist in these reservoirs and all around them. And so I think it takes more concerted, like, international efforts like that to really start to understand the paradigm of the new Arctic. And so I hope to see more just like that one. All right, I'll pass it on to you now, Dave. What's next for you?
Well, I can't say, but I just am constantly reinforced about the importance of science communication. And we look at climate change, and the polar regions are so far away, people don't relate to them. But I hope the film conveys the idea that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And I think it's so important to describe the process of science and explain some of these pressing environmental issues to the broadest public. And in this film, we tried to do it by including the geopolitics and the indigenous people and the historic perspective and so forth. And that's my goal, to be able to continue doing that. And if I have an opportunity to do it in the Arctic again, I would love to. And I would just like to, in closing, say that this film, Frozen Obsession, will be airing on PBS starting in April. But we don't have firm air dates yet, so just check your local listings. But Frozen Obsession will be on PBS sometime this summer. Ed, how about you?
I'm working on a book. I'm going to revisit all of the biological hotspots that I visited, say, between 30 and 40 years ago, places I've written about and traveled through. And, to give you a few examples, Banks Island, where in 1990 or 1988, when I was first there, 2/3 of all the muskox in the world were on that one island. And also, along with 500,000 snow geese, wolves that are genetically distinct from other wolves in the world. And I want to go back there now because I know it's a much different place. There are far less muskox. Wolves are dispersing. A lot of the tundra lakes have dried up. So I'm going to revisit about 15 of these biological hotspots in the circumpolar world, and describe them, what they were like then, what they're like now, and then maybe project into the future, what will they be in the next 20 or 30 years. And I'm hoping to, I've already done this to some extent, meet up with some of the indigenous people who took me and to some of these places, their perspective of how they see the world has changed, and how it's affected their lives, and where they are going, and where their children are going from there.
I thank you all. I think we have been extraordinarily fortunate at Camden Conference that we've had the opportunity to show this film. I think I've seen notes. I think others of you have as well tonight. And it's been interesting, certainly from a Camden Conference perspective, to have had the conference and rolled on and had such an incredible and extraordinary event. And we thank you, the three of you, so much, for making the film and for coming and bringing it to us. So thank you all, and thanks to everybody who was here tonight and who participated. And we hope you loved it. So thank you, and here's the next time. Thank you.
Thank you.